China, of course, is watching to see, do we have the will, do we have the allies, do we have the capabilities to effectively deter them? I think our failure to stick with Ukraine sends a signal to the Chinese that perhaps the United States, under this administration, is not willing and able to work with allies and to stand up for sovereignty, freedom of navigation, international law, all those things that China is threatening.
I'm Kathy Newman with you for the next 2 hours of news, views and sparkling analysis, of course. First of all, this afternoon, the US Vice President has said he's optimistic a Ukraine peace deal can be reached. It comes as Marco Rubio warned Trump could walk away from negotiations unless progress is made soon. He made the comments yesterday as he boarded his plane back to the US.
We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about in a matter of days, whether or not this is doable over the next few weeks. If it is, we're in. If it's not, then we have other priorities to focus on as well.
It seemed to fly in the face of Donald Trump's pre-election optimism of getting it all done in 24 hours. But this morning, Vice President J.D. Vance was more upbeat when he spoke to Giorgia Meloni in Rome.
We have a couple of important issues to discuss today. I want to update the Prime Minister on some of the negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and also some of the things that have happened. Even in the past 24 hours, we think we have some interesting things to report on, of course, in private. So these negotiations, I won't prejudge them, but we do feel optimistic that we can hopefully bring this war, this very brutal war, to a close.
Well, let's hear now from Alexander Khara, who is former advisor to the Foreign and Defence Ministries of Ukraine. Alexander, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Two pieces of news that have broken within the last couple of hours or so. First of all, reports that the US is offering to ease sanctions on Russia in those peace negotiations. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it's a strange interpretation of peace through strength mantra of the Republican Party to exert pressure over the victim of the aggression and to encourage the aggressor with the prospects of ceasing sanctions, these prospects of getting Russia out of isolation and talking to them how to divide Ukraine and how to increase influence, not just in Europe, but elsewhere. So certainly we are not happy with these talks, but fortunately we see that our European partners are not ready to go this way. They believe that sanctions may be seized or stripped when Russia is ready to sign a peace agreement. I'm highly skeptical of any peace agreements with Russia anytime soon, at least unless there is someone new instead of Mr. Putin. But I believe that European partners, they keep more realistic picture in their minds, and they are on our side rather than being on the Russian side like the current US administration.
If you're skeptical about peace happening anytime soon, you seem to share the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio's sort of pessimism, really, about a deal being done. But doesn't that, in the end, benefit Russia? Because Russia can continue this war for as long as it takes, really. They've got no interest in making peace.
Oh, you're absolutely right. They want to subjugate Ukrainian nation and dismantle Ukrainian statehood. That's why they are continuing this war. They have no interest in any type of peace except of capitulation of Ukraine. But we have no other choice but to fight back. And fortunately, we have Europeans on our side. We consider this war as a genocidal war. And I don't know about any cases in history when there was any room for talks and diplomacy to negotiate an end to the war, which has this genocidal intent and actions.
If these peace talks do fall apart, do you have any confidence that America might resume giving Ukraine military aid?
First of all, the previous Congress and previous president allocated the pretty significant amount of money and weaponry for Ukraine, and this administration is just running out of this material for Ukraine, and they don't have any appetite to vote a new resolution to continue support for Ukraine. And recently, we've seen that Mr. Trump even ruled out possibility of Ukraine of buying Patriot interceptors for Ukrainian defense. So they are trying to exert pressure, and we've seen in March when Trump ceased or stopped supplying Ukraine with weapons and intelligence sharing for 5 or 6 days, because he wanted Ukraine to agree on this rare material deal. And there is no, let's say, hope in Ukraine that he may change his mind anytime soon.
And I said there were two bits of breaking news in the last few hours. Just to ask you finally about the second piece of news, which was that Volodymyr Zelensky said today that Chinese companies that Kyiv had earlier imposed sanctions on were involved in the production of Russian Iskander missiles. There is this growing sense, isn't there, that China is deeply involved in this conflict?
For sure. China is a natural partner for Russia because they bear the same hatred towards liberal democracy in West in general, in particular the United States. And China bailed out Russia for many occasions. They are buying huge amount of Russian energy, and they are providing Russia with many type of goods, including dual-use goods, to produce weapons and to fuel this war. So we are worrying. And actually, if you have a look at the situation in general, Ukraine is a non-nuclear country that is fighting the major nuclear country on our continent, that is being supported by DPRK, which is a nuclear country, China with a nuclear country, and threshold country like Iran. So yes, we are worrying because we just like we were losing our people in our territory, and we want to survive. We need assistance from the United States, Europe, and from other partners. And now we see that Chinese are more involved in supporting Russia in producing weaponry. And we would expect some reaction from Washington, who believes that China is a major threat to its hegemony and interests, not just in the region, but elsewhere. So we'd love to see some sanctions that would cut this supplies of the Chinese materials to Russia.
Alexander Kara, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Former advisor to the Foreign and Defence Ministries of Ukraine there. Well, let's turn now to Ben Hodges, who's former commanding general of US Army in Europe. Good afternoon, Ben. Commander, I should say. General.
No, Ben is
Get
fine.
my titles right. General, the reports that the US is offering to ease sanctions on Russia in this peace proposal. What would be your take on that?
Well, a huge mistake. I mean, the administration's approach has been to basically take the side of the Kremlin from the very beginning. I mean, the start point was that Ukraine was going to have to give up territory. And I've seen only pressure on Ukraine to make concessions, not even criticism of Russia. And so the idea that somehow, they're already talking about taking sanctions, relieving sanctions on Russia. I don't know how that advances America's interest, and it certainly does not move us any closer to peace.
Well, what's your assessment then, given you've heard the conflicting views of Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, the latter more optimistic than the former? Is your hunch now that these talks are going to fall apart, that peace is really getting rather distant on this?
Well, it's hard to know exactly who is the voice here. I mean, even on the president's team, between Secretary Rubio and Mr. Witkoff and General Kellogg, it was never really clear to me who was the lead here. And then, of course, the vice president does exactly as you say, have a different sort of a sense of things. And I don't know if Secretary Rubio was just exasperated after spending a couple of days there working on it. It seems to me that because the administration started off wrong-footed with this by they didn't appreciate the nature of this war. They didn't appreciate the history of it, the fact that it's been going on for 11 years. And I think there was probably a degree of arrogance that they thought that they could just walk in, direct what was going to happen, and that'd be it. As you said earlier, the Russians have no interest in getting to a settlement where Ukraine survives as a sovereign state.
Right. So if these talks fall apart, Vladimir Putin is the winner.
Actually, I'm not sure. I think for the Russians, the fact that if the United States does, in fact, turn its back on all of this and go on to other priorities, as Secretary Rubio said, then I don't know who else is actually going to be carrying the water for the Kremlin. Europe is not confused about who the bad guy is here.
Right.
And when Europe, that includes obviously UK and Canada. And as we heard from General Cavoli just the other day, Supreme Allied Commander, he said that Ukraine is actually winning this war on the battlefield. So I don't know that this is a good thing for Russia.
Right, that's fascinating. So actually a bad deal for Ukraine is worse than anything else. Actually, it might be just as well for this to fall apart. And Russia then, I suppose the only question in my mind, based on what you've just said, is whether Europe has the sort of military might to back Ukraine to hang on in this war.
Yeah, the only thing that Europe lacks right now is self-confidence. If you add together the militaries, the economies, the industries, and the populations of all of Europe plus Canada, it dwarfs Russia. I mean, it's not even close. But the self-confidence is not there, and hopefully the work that's being done by UK and France, and soon maybe Germany after their government's in place, the coalition of the willing will actually begin to coalesce around those leading nations.
Fascinating. So, yeah, it's possible to see the shape of something here, a European coalition, as you say, that could actually end up playing rather well for Ukraine. But does it require the US to resume military aid to Kyiv?
It would be much better if my country would resume providing capabilities, intelligence, all these things that help protect Ukrainian civilians from these Russian attacks against cities and civilian targets. But that Europe has a lot of capability. And again, Ukraine has stopped Russia on the battlefield. The only thing that they can't stop by themselves is these murderous attacks on cities. So I think that Europe does have the capability. I wish that my country would get back involved in it. What's been missing all along is a clear declaration of the desired outcome of the strategic objective. The Biden administration failed to say that they wanted Ukraine to win. So you got to get the objective right, and then you can develop meaningful policies.
Well, we've been talking about conventional warfare. Of course, that's your bread and butter. But there's meanwhile a trade war that Donald Trump has unleashed. We've just had a statement through from Downing Street saying that Keir Starmer has spoken to Donald Trump this afternoon, and they began by discussing ongoing and productive discussions between the UK and the US on trade. And the Prime Minister reiterated his commitment to free and open trade. The two leaders actually also discussed the situation in Ukraine, as we've just been debating. But in your view, is Donald Trump now potentially realising that he's bitten off more than he can chew in this trade war? He's slightly retreating here, do you think?
Yeah, actually, the backblast or backlash against the president and his team for these tariffs and the other things that they're doing that are damaging our relationships with longtime allies and trade partners. He's starting to hear about it from even people who supported him during the campaign. I'm talking about big business, industry, et cetera, as well as hardworking taxpayers at the lower end of the spectrum. So I think he is starting to back away a little bit, and frankly, we're starting to see resistance in other places, both from conservative media. From the courts, from universities are starting to push back. So I think your characterization that he might have bitten off more than he could chew is accurate.
Do you think that he may end up suing for peace with China in the trade war there?
Well, I sure don't know. The Chinese have not given any indication that they're prepared to back down first. So it's hard to say. I guess that's the characteristic of this administration, is that they don't do anything that's normal or traditional sort of approach, whether it's diplomacy or trade or anything. Yeah. And so it's hard to predict with any certainty what the administration will do.
I mean, Donald Trump has said he's confident of reaching a deal with China, so perhaps that's another straw in the wind. But, I wonder what your take is as a military man on the consequences if there is no rapprochement between China and US on trade, because there are those I've been speaking to behind the scenes who warn of actual war between America and China if this trade dispute gets out of hand.
Well, I suppose that's a possibility. And China, of course, is watching to see, do we have the will, do we have the allies, do we have the capabilities to effectively deter them? I think our failure to stick with Ukraine sends a signal to the Chinese that perhaps the United States under this administration is not willing and able to work with allies and to stand up for sovereignty, freedom of navigation, international law, all those things that China is threatening. And so I think our allies in Japan and South Korea, Philippines, they're also very uneasy about our commitment.
Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, thank you very much for joining us.